socially radical, socially radical, socially radical. Socially radical, socially radical, socially radical. Guitarist. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Socially Radical Guitarist. Song you heard just now was Twasezereye from Bikindi Simon. It's basically, in English, it means we said goodbye. And that's referring to the monarchy. The context, the song was sung basically during the Civil War when the RPF had occupied the northern part of Rwanda, and that was before the peace accords, but they were singing these songs leading up to the peace accords. And the main goal of the song was about getting people to say goodbye to the monarchy, referring to the Tutsi monarchy that the Hutu revolution overthrew in 1962. So, yeah, a lot of Hutu nationalists will sing this song and will play this song. I'm not a Hutu nationalist. I'm a communist. I'm against tribalism. I'm not in favor of it. The main reason I played this song was to stick it to Kagame. That is the only reason. And also to show solidarity to the FDLR, which has the right to fight against colonialism and the current Tutsi monarch in sitting in office right now, Paul Kagame. So in order to show solidarity to the FDLR's right to bear arms to defend the refugees in Congo and to fight against the monarchy, that's why I decided to play this song together. Also to stick it to Kagame. Yeah, in principles of anti-imperialism, you have to be on the side of the oppressed. You have to be a side of the colonized. And the colonized right now are the Hutu peasants, the Hutu farmers, and a lot of Tutsi farmers as well. Really, the only people that have benefited from this regime is the nobility that had close connections to the descendant of a monarch in Kagame. So, yeah, just going through my disclaimer because we're going to need it for this show. Anything that I say and that the guests I bring on say are the opinions of the host and the guests respectively. They have nothing to do with Radio Waterloo, any of its subsidiaries or its affiliates. So, no, try as you might, you can't sue public radio. And while ASIC is sponsoring this show, the opinions expressed on the show are the opinions of the hosts and the guests respectively. So, no, you cannot sue the nonprofit either. Do not sue African and Caribbean Inclusion Center. Support the African and Caribbean Inclusion Center. Also support the Canada Files, which my guest for today, Daniel G, is an associate editor. They have a fundraising drive going on. Make sure to check that out. Support it. And if you have deep pockets, also support the GoFundMe campaign for ASIC Canada, or just donate directly to ASIC Canada. Now, getting into this style of music, what's brilliant about it is because of how frequent the harmonies are with the singing and how busy the percussion is and the bass playing. You can fill the music with single lines from the guitar. Basically just playing the root of each chord. And that brilliance and intricacy is always there, and available, so long as the vocals are as busy as they are and the bass and the drums are as busy as they are. It's a very interesting and beautiful type of music where you have some clapping and you have the bass getting busy and playing, and it's in 5/4. Yeah, so it's in 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And um, that allows a lot of creativity with the singing, with the lyrics, and yeah, even the guitar, even though it's doing single lines, single chord lines, uh, it has room for flexibility with the music. Um, and towards the end, when things get a little busy, um, the guitar will be playing, um, you know, two note chords. And yeah, Bikindi Simon, it's a shame that he died in prison for, genocide incitement. I feel like the music itself was kind of misrepresented. Um, the the judges actually didn't judge against them on the music. The UN judges, they judged against them on the on the rallies he was doing on the ground in Kigali. So he was yelling through the megaphone, trying to get people to rally and support the government. Um, Now, with the fighting, there was supposed to be a peace accords, um, in '94, and Habyarimana and the Burundian president were gonna go over to sign that. The UN, coincidentally, under the leadership of Romeo Dallaire, who's supposedly called a hero, um, cut off a part of the airport, so the plane had to come in another way, right in the line of fire of a rocket launcher, which directly targeted the plane. And it's clear and obvious who did it. It was the RPF. And when you realize that it was the RPF, when you connect the dots, and when you realize that the guy that convicted Bikindi Simon is like the presiding judge, particularly, was from Jamaica. Jamaica is actually part of the constitutional monarchy. It's part of the current Commonwealth realm. And you know that the UK was arming and supporting the RPF. And when you connect all of the dots, you realize what imperialism is doing there. And how a refugee crisis spilled over into the Congo, how these disasters happened from 1996 onward, why Congo had to be destabilized, and what the objective was. And the objective was to extract those minerals without paying any taxes. And in light of all of this conspiracy, you realize that those refugees stuck in Congo have a right to defend themselves. I mean, Kagame will call them genocidaires, but the majority of the fighting force, vast majority, there's probably only about maybe 2, 3 generals that could have been alive and functioning and sentient during that period. Everybody else was basically a year or 2 years old at that time. Um, Among the active force, the active force is very young, in the 20s, mid 20s, late 20s. There's just no way that they are genocidaires. They're taking up arms to defend themselves, and they have the right to do that. Um, and yeah, just uttering this nonsense genocidaire in order to cover up the crimes you committed in the Congo when you invaded, and the fact that you're stealing minerals. I mean, that was the payoff for colluding with the Commonwealth realm and Canadian mining companies, is that he gets his cut when he goes in there. When he goes into the Congo, he gets to take minerals and loot North and South Kivu. And that's the dynamics. You see mining companies putting in incredibly racist and brutal governments, and people having no choice, being backed into a corner, having no choice but to raise up arms, and then being called terrorists for it. Now, the FDLR per se isn't on the list, but there's another organization that is on the list, that was on the list, that really shouldn't have been, and shouldn't be, and still is, and that is the Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias de Colombia, the FARC, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. And that segues into the next part of the show, where Daniel G is going to brilliantly explain the history and why these people are taking up arms and what the Canadian government has to do with it and why they're registered as a terrorist organization, even though for the last 3 or 4 years they were a legal and registered member of parliament in Colombia. So they're participating in the government legally, and they're a legally registered party, yet for some reason they're still listed as terrorists by the Canadian government. And you'll learn why, and what these Canadian mining companies like Eco Oro and all of these other subsidiaries, divisions, are up to around the world, and what politicians are doing and why they're colluding with that. And you'll understand why, as communists, being anti-imperialist is the primary thing. I hear a lot of criticism, especially during the election time, of the thing about tankies is they only care about imperialism. They're not worried about the domestic issues. But that's a fallacy. It's a fallacy that those two are separate. They're not separate. If a party is willing to concede to the interests of the imperialists abroad, then they're willing to concede to the interests of the ruling class at home. So the imperial ruling class, if they're being given away with the propaganda and the justifications for this brutal foreign policy, then inevitably you're going to end up with anti-worker policies at home. And then people, when they make this complaint, aren't able to find the connections of why their social democratic party of choice, after being put into power, or their Justice Democrat of choice, or their New Democratic Party member of choice, or the Greens or the Bloc Québécois or whatever, failed to live up to their commitments on a key vote. And if you're a Marxist, you'll understand it right away, especially if you subscribe to Lenin's analysis of imperialism. And it's because the politician has already shown you what team they're on by subscribing to imperialist propaganda. And they can know better. They're privy to certain things. They've got intelligence. They've got the analysis. If they were pro-worker, they would have at least studied and read up on these two people, Marx and Lenin. But then you find that they're going along with imperialist propaganda, uttering the really warmongering rhetoric against other countries. And then you wonder why they're not keeping their promises at home. But the answer is obvious. They already showed you what team they're on with their foreign policy. So that's something for people to really note. And it's also something for people to really note that the policy is so brutal that people are being backed into a corner and have no choice but to take up arms. And I've never been a pacifist, but those that are pacifists need to really think about that. Because their taking up arms wasn't really their choice. It was the conditions set for them. And it's the conditions set for them by your government. And if you claim that your government can be dealt with peacefully, then you need to deal with it peacefully here, so that it doesn't brutalize people abroad to the point where they have no choice but to rise up and defend themselves. That will make things easier for the people abroad. They'll see that solidarity. They'll see that support, if it's there. If people are actually getting involved in trying to do something. Now, the unfortunate thing is, in bourgeois democracies, especially nowadays, even in the U.S., which I wouldn't call a bourgeois democracy anymore, it's too far gone. When January 6th happens, it's too far gone. But when you see like the so-called solidarity being funneled into one issue group, like you'll have a Palestine Solidarity Organization, but it's a one issue group. You'll have a Venezuela Solidarity Organization in one issue group. Venezuela doesn't get the numbers that the Palestine Solidarity did last year, and even that was new. Like, the consciousness is emerging But sooner or later, people are going to realize that they're going to have a political alternative to back that. And I argue that it's the Communist Party of Canada. And so does my guest, Daniel G. He's a member of the party. And look forward to his investigative reporting on Colombia, the history, what's going on, what these mining companies are doing, and how anti-black, anti-LGBT the current Colombian government actually is. So look forward to that. And look forward to this next song. So during the intermission, we're going to have a song from the FARC. And it's called La Guenena. And it's kind of a folk song that's regularly sang. It's done by los Companeros de la FARC, La Guenena. So look forward to that, and then look forward to the interview after the intermission. Stay tuned.
Trepando la cordillera en la ofensiva popular, trepando la cordillera en la ofensiva popular. Ya en las calles se ve la candela insurreccional, ya en las calles se ve la candela insurreccional. Trincheras y barricadas encienden la capital, trincheras y barricadas encienden la capital. Ya Bolívar volvió con guerrillas a Bogotá, ya Bolívar volvió con guerrillas a Bogotá. Manuel y su muchachada, la guaneña también está, Manuel y su muchachada, la guaneña también está. Lo encontrará, y si el gringo ladrón busca pleito lo encontrará. La guerra patria en Colombia seguro que estallará, la guerra patria en Colombia seguro que estallará. Unidad, unidad es consigna para triunfar, unidad, unidad es consigna para triunfar. Ecuador, Perú y Bolivia que se juntan para pelear, Ecuador, Perú y Bolivia que se juntan para pelear. Y también marcharán Venezuela y Panamá, y también marcharán Venezuela y Panamá. desde la tierra de fuegos, todo el pueblo combatirá. Hasta el mismo río Bravo, la patria se extenderá. Hasta el mismo río Bravo, la patria se extenderá. Con las FARC, la guaneña se fue a pelear. Con las FARC, la guaneña se fue a pelear. Trepando la cordillera en la ofensiva popular. Trepando la cordillera en la ofensiva popular. Con las FARC, la guaneña se fue a pelear. Con las FARC, la guaneña se fue a pelear. Trepando la cordillera en la ofensiva popular. Trepando la cordillera en la ofensiva popular. Con las FARC, la guaneña se fue a pelear. Con las FARC, la guaneña se fue a pelear. Trepando la cordillera en la ofensiva popular.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Socially Radical Guitarist. So the song you heard just now was from La Companeros' FARC-EP called La Guenena. So just a reminder to everybody that these people, they take up arms for a reason. And in this case, the reason is partly the Canadian government. And now the guest is going to be touching upon that. His name is Daniel Z. He's the associate editor of the Canada Files. He's also a comrade, a member of the party, a member of the Communist Party of Canada. Hello, Daniel.
Hello, Christian. Pleasure to be on here today.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you. Thank you for accepting the invite. Just wanting to, get right into the article that you put up on Canada Files, talking about Colombia. You basically made two major points. The first major point is that Canada has complicity in the atrocities that the Colombian government is committing. And the second is that this government is a far-right, anti-Black, anti-LGBT, anti-worker, anti-peasant government. So can you elaborate on those two basically summaries that you had made in the article?
So for the article on Colombia, so what I discovered in my research, as well as my discussions with both Pablo Vianco, the former director of Telesur and the current member of the Canadian Latin American Alliance, as well as a Colombian that on the ground. So what I found out is that the current chain of protests, the recent protests in Colombia is caused by an effort to push forth a tax reform that would have provided massive breaks for corporations while overtaxing the impoverished working class. It gave way to mass protests in which the Colombian state responded with some horrific violence. There was details of horrific police brutality, murders by the police, actual sexual violence being carried out. And what I learned is that basically this all ties back to the fact that the current government, which is led by Ivan Duque, who's a member of the far-right party of Alvaro Uribe, the president of Colombia in the 2000s, and basically what they represent the interests of the elite landholders in Colombia, which have owned 81% of the land. With this disparity, Vivianco noting, going back to the colonial period under Spanish rule. The current wave of violence was unleashed in the 1940s with the assassination of Jorge Gaitan, the Colombian president that basically promised land reform but got assassinated, and this led to the period called La Violencia, a period of political violence that culminated in the rise of FARC, which seeks to overthrow the landholding class and create a government that is more equitable for that can go all through the more equitable land reform. And I've noticed that during this crisis, the Canadian governments, they've been backing the Colombian government against the FARC. The Canadian government in the 1990s, they've basically sent over attack helicopters to Colombia despite the fact that arms treaties prevented them from doing so, by basically sending the helicopters over to the United States to be sold. And even more, in the 2013, the Harper government added Colombia to the automated firearms country control list, which allowed them to purchase automatic firearms such as assault rifles. This basically created a protest from the human rights organizations such as Amnesty International, which was concerned they might find their way into the hands of paramilitaries or human rights abusers. 80% of the human rights abuse being tied to far-right paramilitaries, but the Canadian government obviously gave no concern about this. In the recent protests, the Colombians security forces were using APCs manufactured in Barrie, Ontario by Incas and in a 2015 report, it's found that Colombia also paid $84 million for 32 bulletproof armor vehicles from the Canadian affiliate of General Dynamics Land Systems to be used on the border with Venezuela for the purpose of basically saber rattling, because the government accused the Venezuelan government of fomenting FARC terrorism in Colombia, and to also be used against quote-unquote illegal armed groups. So Canada played a major role in basically perpetuating police brutality in Colombia and basically helping the Colombian army and security force against FARC. And what's worse is that many of these against FARC, and what's noteworthy is that many of these security forces, they were actually trained by the RCMP and the Canadian Border Security Agency. Canada has provided $5.4 million through the anti-crime capacity building program to facilitate this training. So we have an example of police brutality in Canada making its way to influence police and military brutality in Colombia. And this is exactly how Canada is complicit in the atrocities in Colombia. They basically are helping this regime that's trying to preserve the status quo of land inequality and social hierarchy, this horrific status quo. They're helping to basically perpetuate and uphold. And so you mentioned that you one of the other takeaways is that the Colombian government is a far-right regime we shouldn't be associated with. And that's exactly the case. The party that Ivan Duque and Alvaro Uribe belongs to, which is the Democratic Center Party, they're tied to the landholding class, as I said, as Pablo Vivianco told me. And during the 2012 to 2016 negotiation for the peace treaty in Colombia that was undertaken by Juan Manuel Santos, the liberal president, Uribe and the Democratic Center, they basically spread trumped up rumors that the the peace treaty would impose quote unquote gender ideology supported by Venezuela in Colombia. It's basically the sort of thing you'd expect Rebel News or Maxime Bernier or the Conservative Party to say. And what they were specifically targeting was the fact that the original draft of the peace process provided significant protections for Afro-Colombians, indigenous Colombians, women, and LGBTQIA minorities in identities in Colombia. And they basically raised fear-mongering over this, and they basically caused a referendum in which 50.2% of the population narrowly rejected the promised draft, of the Constitution, and the revision watered down and made murky some of these protections. So basically, it's much harder to protect indigenous Colombians or LGBTIQ people because they've been all lumped into the marginalized populations provision within that peace treaty, and they basically emphasize women more than any other sexual identity. So it basically put a lot of marginalized groups at risk to further political violence, which has resulted in many massacres and the deaths of 1,000 social movement leaders in Colombia. And basically, when it resulted in the deaths of 1,000 social movement leaders in Colombia. And what should be noted is that during the protest, one of the demands of the protesters was for the leadership of the DC Democratic Center, such as Uribe and Santos, to face trial for crimes against humanity. And these crimes against humanity were spurred not only by the scrapping of any sort of protections of marginalized identities, but also the fact that the peace treaty made it so that any sort of land in the conflict zones can't be divided to the peasants, and that the FARC will have to have 30% of its federal funding cut if they organize politically to prevent them from taking power. So I think that DC is somewhat aware how popular the FARC's ideas are and are trying to work to get them to not come to power electorally. So looking at the polls in Colombia and what's at stake in the next election, it seems that FARC could potentially get to power by electoral means and be the part of a new pink tide that had swept once again through Bolivia with the defeat of the Añez coup, and in Peru with the victory of Pedro Castillo.
Excellent.
So, and what I want to discuss overall with the article is that Canada is actually a major force of imperialism in the world. We are not just like, say, we not only march with the US in lockstep with stuff like, say, the new Cold War and saber rattling against China, but we've also been, our mining companies, as a graph being passed around on Twitter, have investments in 74.5% of our mining companies have investments in 74.5% of the world, with the graph showing our investments in Africa. So there's this idea that and Colombia is actually one of the places our mining oil companies have interest in, and they're being helped by the Canadian government, not only through their deals with the far-right Democratic Center and its politicians, but also through its but also through the fact that Canada has helped liberalize Columbia's laws, first by creating a constitutional amendment that allows 40% of Columbia land to essentially be free property for mining companies, which basically creates even more dispossession. And our mining and oil companies themselves employ paramilitaries to basically drive people, specifically indigenous and Afro-Colombians, out of land in order to basically hoard the land for their mining and oil projects. It's clear that Canada's foreign policy shows that not only it's anti-Black and anti-Indigenous on a global scale, not just on a domestic scale, but it's not a country that's paints itself as this friendly, polite face and somehow less quote unquote meaner than the US. It's pretty fucking terrible in its own way. And I hope that people around the world pay attention to that. So given how Justin Trudeau's efforts last year to get into the Security Council failed big time, it may well be that they are paying attention to this issue. But I hope that Canadians also pay attention to this issue too, and demand in elections such as this one that we change our country's foreign policy from imperialist one to an independent and diplomacy-oriented one that does not step into the dictations of the US and our mining and oil companies that seek to export so much of the world and cause ecological damage and dispossession of indigenous and other marginalized identities.
Yeah, that's a great message to go with a great article. Yeah, that was a great, summation of all of the topics in that article and what was going on. Going to domestic politics, I noticed that you were on track to write something for the Toronto Climate Justice, Climate Justice Ontario, CTJO.
CJTO.
CGTO, Climate Justice Toronto, and you wanted to maybe be a little bit more diplomatic than the message that you really want to make on the Canada Files, where you're explicit and you talk about what Canada.
So for the CJTO article, I want to examine some of the policies of the NDP going to the election. And my argument is that the Canadian left should not depend on the NDP as the source of progressive change. The NDP has had a really problematic foreign policy that at best only softens Canadian imperialism, but at worst actually helps precipitating it, while the domestic and climate justice policies do little to ensure COVID zero or mass access to the vaccines or mass access to ways to keep the COVID numbers down. And they've also and with regards to environment and indigenous justice, if you look at Fairy Creek, if you look at what John Horgan's doing, the NDP have both betrayed climate justice principles and the just principles of indigenous self-determination in favor of the pipelines. And I'm trying to argue that the left should be more critical. We should focus on building alliances, independent and coalitions, independent of the electoral politics.
Yeah, you did say you wanted to write a book about that. Can you talk a little bit about that book?
And I'm thinking of expanding this into a book later on. Mm-hmm. If the article is successful enough, detailing a more critical look at the NDP from a left-wing lens.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, so I mean that was basically it for today. All that we were going to talk about. Thank you for coming on, Daniel.
You're welcome.
Yeah. And now we're going to be heading out, and I'm going to be playing something.
It's the Fait with the Oiseaux from the company Quill.
Oh, yes. Daniel actually asked me to play. The first one to do that. So we're going to be heading into me playing. I've got to get my guitar. And then after that, we'll have the outro, and that'll be the end of the show. So stay tuned. Socially radical. Socially radical. Socially radical. Socially radical. Socially radical. Socially radical. Guitar.